way back at the end of the 60s, San Francisco was a magnet and everyone was coming here, so I came here. And at the time, at the end of the 60s, everyone was fleeing the city. They were going to the country and all that. And so with that, I moved to New England and started building houses with old Yankee carpenters. And so we built salt boxes and colonials and capes, and I lived there for 3 winters. And it was nice. I learned a lot with these old craftspeople there, and came out on vacation. Thought, oh yeah, come back to San Francisco. It's more open-minded, and it's a carpenter's dream town for wood frame houses. And so I moved back here, and I got in with a company called San Francisco Renaissance.
I worked for San Francisco Victoriana from 75 to 78 when one of the initial real estate booms kind of hit the Bay Area, hit San Francisco, and we restored Victorian house fronts. It was sort of a facade a month, essentially, for maybe the 3 years that I was there. Houses that had been stripped of their ornament and had stucco applied, or asbestos shingles, or permastone, or whatever.
They were the style was, after World War II, San Francisco changed again, kind of like it is now, and the Victorians had fallen into disrepair. And so people moved into the Haight and they fixed them up, and they painted them, they added additions. But also after World War II, there was a style called Bauhaus style, where they were modernizing them. And so they stripped the Victorian facades, which were half fallen apart anyway, and stuccoed them over. San Francisco Renaissance took the stucco off, read the scars under them, and built new facades. So I got into it with the background of New England building and the carpentry of the Victorian style by working with Renaissance.
So when those houses were originally built, oftentimes they were built from pattern books that had remarkably little detail in them. They had a general idea of what the facade was supposed to look at. They might have had a smattering of little details, but clearly they depended on a skilled carpenter to interpret them. And Skeeter's one of the guys who's been doing that long enough that he is one of those skilled carpenters. Bay Area architects like the Newsom brothers had pattern books where they would have, maybe 40 or 50 different facade designs in a book, along with sketches that showed what the general character was supposed to be, but clearly someone had to interpret those plans as well. I think they did full sets of plans often, but they also sold the pattern books to builders who would then interpret and build those structures. And I think Skeeter really, he's one of the last guys who's kind of doing what he's doing. When I was introduced to that world, we were kind of learning and teaching ourselves how this would be done. So figuring out what ornament was missing from the house, designing it, figuring out how to make it, and then working with contractors to install it. Over time, contractors like Skeeter learned to be able to figure out how to do this stuff themselves. They didn't necessarily need a design, and I think in Skeeter's case, he loves the creative process and adding his own personal touches to it, and considers himself a Victorian carpenter.
I had this horrible house. I mean, I've been here 22 years. It has needed absolutely everything. And the outside and inside was laughable when I moved here. And I kept looking, not just in the neighborhood, but all over the city to find a house that had the roof line. Like, what was it like originally? What did it look like? And I couldn't find anything that was as hideous as the roof line. And then, I mean, I was just curious, but then it turned out there was a lot of water damage under the stucco. And I had to take it all off, and then we could see that there used to be a smaller Queen Anne, and that the people who lived here in the 1930s had lifted up the sides and cut the middle, and they had created 2 rooms, which meant, as it turned out, you could never get back without like tearing the house apart. You could never get back to the historical reality of what it was. And there was a model on this block and elsewhere for what it had been, but without finding the shadow of what had been there, we would never have known, because there was nothing that looked like the house as it stood. My requirements were, it had to fit into the neighborhood, and in terms of roof line. So originally it was Queen Anne, then it was like this, and then we just flattened it out, and so it's in keeping with everything else. First part of this project was tearing out the windows. The windows here were old aluminum windows, and especially upstairs, they were, if you tried to open them, they were ready to fall out, which was really scary. I didn't want my kids to be touching the windows, and when I go through the neighborhood or the extended neighborhood, the windows drive me insane. More and more the old houses have replaced windows with vinyl especially, but they just ruin the houses. And I looked for a long time I didn't even know what kind of windows would be right for this house. Did they have little panes? Did they not have little panes? I knew they were going to be sash windows. I knew they'd have little ears. I think that's what they're called these days, on the bottom. And I went to all the window companies, the standard window companies, and they didn't make them with ears. And I was going to get windows with ears, and there was this one company that said, "Oh, we'll screw some ears on for you, because we do screw-on ears," and you could see the line. I finally found wooden windows, and I thought, I can't believe I didn't know this existed. And making real, what I call real windows, that is, windows that are in keeping with the house. But no, they made an absolutely huge difference, and people knew what they were doing, which was delightful. And I really want to tear out the windows of all my neighbors and make them. I have fantasies of winning the lottery and changing the facades and windows of half the neighborhood here. But then there was Burning Man. So I wouldn't say it was a big problem, but Burning Man was really important to Skeeter, and so he began working on his Burning Man projects, and that was delightful to watch too. Skeeter's set up as he does in front of the house, and but it was delightful because everyone in the neighborhood was interested in what he was doing.
In the old days, they would set up their tables instead of being crowded in. You can't go on the sidewalk, you can't make dust, you can't make noise. They'd set up in the middle of the street, whole carpentry shop, and build the whole block. And they were able to be creative then. They could come up with whatever they wanted, not all these restrictions and guidelines, and none of it for the better. I mean, I think left to their own devices, people do awful things. So there should be historic guidelines, but they're misguided the way that they are now. And so I just have to work around it and say, well, it's been changed, so it's no longer historically significant. They say it's got to go back the way that it was, good or bad, whatever it was. was. You know, they're all kind of Victorian, but Victorian is such a broad category. It goes anywhere from elegant Eastlake to Wild West honky tonk, you know, and it's all Victorian. So there's a lot of different styles, and even in San Francisco, the styles are all mixed up. So there are very few pure styles. So there is the Queen Anne. It went into the era of Queen Anne, and Victorian, the era of Queen Victoria, and then it went into Edwardian much later and much plainer, the era of King Edward. So in all those categories, they mixed them up. They added additions, and then some of them became hybrids.
I think it was, in a way, kind of a common perception of what an elegant residence would look like, and there was a lot of fashion involved. So after Italianates, when stick style came in, and suddenly we were looking at ornament that wasn't based on any kind of classical antecedent at all that you could discern.
It evolved into this unique style of San Francisco in the facades. Whimsical, lots of it, opulent, and all mixed up, like anything goes. You go towards one style, other elements would be added in, and here San Francisco sort of developed its own style. They're only the fronts of the buildings. It's not freestanding like out in, there's Victorians everywhere, but they've rotted away, and they would have maybe porches wrapping around them, and turrets, and an interesting roof line, and balustrades and all. But in San Francisco, it's all in the front, and so they can put a whole lot more detail in the front. And so it kind of evolved into this mix-up of Victorian styles, all in the front, and lots of it. All the elements are very tight together, so you don't have any mercy of, like, if it's stucco and there's a big broad area between elements. Here everything's so crowded, there's so many layers and so many things crowded together, you don't have much room in between. And so maybe there would be a bracket that would come off of the building, and so the cornice would have to come out so far to rest upon that bracket, and then there's a series of moldings on there. Between the outermost point of that cornice to the wall or the frieze, there's another series of moldings in there. So to make room to accommodate all these elements is kind of a layout challenge. Then there'd be, I guess the flat stocks would go on there. Everything flat, mainly the vertical and horizontal flat stocks, and upon that would go millwork, brackets, and all. In between and wrapping around the brackets, everything would be moldings. Sometimes there would be some ornamental plaster in there too, and so they'd be in recessed panels. And so laying out all of those layers to accommodate so that you get this finished look of it gets sort of overwhelming. I mean, I would look at a finished job and think, geez, anyone would look and see, where do you begin with that?
I think in the case of Victorian buildings, it was kind of underestimated exactly what that ornament was doing. A lot of those cornices and window trims were preventing rainwater from running straight down the face of the building and across the windows that you end up having to replace because they're not at all protected anymore. I mean, if you look at those buildings up close, as I had the opportunity to do, and as Skeeter continues to do, you'll see how well thought out they are in terms of their ability to resist the elements, partly because of what they were made of, but also partly because there was a tradition and a vernacular knowledge of how these things were supposed to go together. They weren't just, they were very well thought out. The flashing details were well thought out. The layering of Victorian facades, for me, was a complete revelation when I realized, oh, well, yeah, that's a really ornate looking facade, but actually you can put it together in a stepwise process where you're really considering the fact that this is an outdoor sculpture, the sort that has to last for a long time.
It becomes overwhelming to even, consider how it would all go together. But it has a certain look. Again, that unique look of San Francisco to its style and how you trim a bay window, a portico, a roof line, a cornice, a main cornice at the top, a belt cornice, and all the other things. And then the other challenge is how all these pieces come together, how they join together and kind of mismatch and wrap around so that it just falls into place and looks normal in its complex way. I'll come up with the concept design and then draw that in, and even that will change some. And so then made to suit whatever my cornice is, whatever the say the shape of the building. If I have an arch and I want a certain bracket to go under there, I'll draw it freehand on a piece of plywood or something, and then I'll test that and see how it looks, and adjust it around, and then from that make my final pattern out of plywood, and then I use that to trace upon wood that would be cut out to laminate to make the various parts. Or if I make a cornice, I'll have a cross section of that cornice as a pattern to lay out what I'm doing, or to cut. A cornice is a series of moldings. It has a crown molding and a fascia and a soffit and some brackets under there, many layers of things. And then holding that as a structure I call lookout blocks. So having that whole pattern kind of drawn, you can see what the elements are going to be, and so make the structure for it. I can hold it up in place, see if I want more projection, more drop, or a different shape. And then I'm thinking of the whole facade at once, so I have some continuity going through. I don't just randomly put parts all over until it looks like it's done. If there's a certain shape, a curve, a square, a diamond, some organic leafy pattern, I'll have that throughout. And so I'm kind of keeping that in mind as I lay things out and where I place these elements. Then there's ornamental plasterwork, which might be some scrolly thing or some flowery or leafy or band. And so I have copies of different plaster parts too, and then I have molds for those. I use other molds, but again, everything is packed so deep that I'll have a pattern here of what I do have in the molds of ornamental plaster, in the cross sections of cornices, and some sample brackets. Then when it's painted too, if those elements are painted with an accent color or a gold leaf or something, you also want that to kind of spread out. You don't want just a concentration of one thing in one spot and something completely different on the other part of the facade. So there's a continuity to it.
I think Skeeter really likes restoring the ornament on the front of the buildings and considers himself a Victorian carpenter. So what makes him different is that he's continued in sort of practicing the restoration of Victorian facades past the point when it was a fad market. There's still a lot of owners of Victorians who very much appreciate them and need the skills of someone like Skeeter.
He can transform any space into something really special.
So I think the most rewarding thing is it's something artsy. It's like a big sculpture you can climb around on, and it's got a lot of varieties. And I'm outside, I'm all over town. Every job is different. I'm not stuck in an office. I love seeing them when it's done. So it is rewarding. And like I say, like San Francisco is my gallery. I can go by and I had a house, I lost a house and all, but I have 100 houses here, that are my houses that anyone could drive by. The painters will paint them up different colors, sometimes awful colors, sometimes really good colors, sometimes they're repainted, but they're all there. It's like a gift to the streets. You can go by and, you can look at the houses. So I like that part of it, and I like the challenge of starting something new and then having that kind of artistic license. Historically, there's some significant buildings, but again, everything was changed so much that some of these things that they added on are not true. And so I build to kind of a formula of more of the pure style of Victorian, add those elements in, and so they're not just arbitrarily made up. They're based in the classics, and then they made it like what do you call historic? You know, it used to be 100 years old. In the 70s, they said, well, let's make it 50 years old because they were starting to destroy the Art Deco period. So they wanted to save the Art Deco period, and they said anything 50 years old. Now 50 years is 1967, as we know, Summer of Love. And all these places were stuccoed over in after World War II, 50s and 60s. That is now historic. If it is historically significant, which used to be 100 years and is now 50 years, and so now the city guidelines, and I have worked with the Victorian Alliance in fighting this because they are against this too. They go by National Historic Preservation Guidelines, which are that if something is old, 50 years, or significant, that it is to be exactly like it is, and if you add an addition, it's got to be modern, stucco and glass. And I say to them, I've never built stucco and glass. How can you say that what I build, which is also, I mean, pretty soon I'm going to be historic, 50 years of building, and I've never built in stucco and glass. How long do you call that modern? And even the Victorian Alliance says, why can't it be of Victorian elements, but different elements to distinguish it from the original part of the building, but still add a balustrade, add something. And the national guidelines is no, because people will think it is historic and it would be false historicism. So they're misinformed, but they're going by national guidelines on this. And so it's sort of mixed up that way to where I can't build Victorian anymore. Things change on buildings. There'd be a garage put in, the garden would be taken out, the stairs would be changed, something else would be changed. So what's left that's historic, you know, one little section of it. And so I put the stuff back on of the period, and some of them are grand building. So history, do you go by that? If it was significant, I'd say yes. And the building I'm doing now, it was significant, I'm putting it back that way. You know, again, to treat them as sculptures, they're all over town. I've done, I think, around 100 facades. And so the gallery is kind of San Francisco, the older neighborhoods. And so you go to build something and you see ideas on other older buildings. So in history, based on history, there's a lot of examples here. So that's one inspiration. And how you combine these elements specific to the site of the new job. Some people, they look at movies and they look in the background and they think, why don't we have all those kind of brackets and balustrades and carvings? And I think it'll come back around again. I don't know if it will be in my working lifetime. And so to do something else, I think that'd be a nice direction.
I would say Victorian restoration has tapered off, certainly. In the 70s and 80s, and maybe into the 90s a little bit, those homes were collectible and affordable, and, well, relatively affordable. And it made sense to restore the facades on them. But as other housing types like arts and crafts homes started getting more attention because they were the next collectible homes, I think, in a lot of ways. So the Victorians were really the craze of the 70s into the 80s, and arts and crafts homes maybe, the 80s and 90s, and it's mid-century modern homes now.
And we have a different lifestyle, so we don't have these tiny little rooms. So a lot of the layout was bad, but the decoration was good. And the idea of decorating everything and pattern on pattern is sort of out. So I like the blend of it. And even architects at the time were revolting from all that factory-made stuff. And so they went into arts and crafts and other styles. My two sons, they grew up here in San Francisco, Maxwell and Lucas. And they said, you gotta start the Clear Heart Institute of Fine Design and Building, and take on energy of this new energy. They'd really like to learn this before it's all gone, because it is on its way out.
Old houses, if they're not taken care of, they're taken down. And then we have buildings coming up that they're boxes, and they're cheap wood, and within a few years the paint looks awful and the windows are terrible, and they have nothing. They have none of the charm of old San Francisco. And I know cities go through phases, and we're just in a really down phase right now, kind of high-tech steel and glass and straight lines. But I'm hoping that before they're all gone, these houses will be taken care of. So.
And I think it just kind of evolved to this void of just nothing and making a killing on it and having them empty. Yet we have all these CNC machines and things where we could produce these parts, but people don't want them. Maybe because it's old-fashioned, and so that's again where I believe in this mix of taking it into the future, putting some sort of ornament or pattern, and you can mass produce that too, and it can be done out of cheaper material and sustainable material, but I think it should have some pattern added on to that use of open space, and we could have all of it.
It could introduce the modern world and the digital world, and put dentals with cell phones or something, and change colors, and take it further. I think that's our responsibility, to take it further.
So I'll have patterns of cross sections of cornices and brackets and parts. I don't know if I'll ever use them again, but and I don't really repeat, but they'll be there for kind of an inspiration, and it's unlikely that all these parts would fit on another building in its proportion, its projection, its height, its shape, its profile, but it's kind of a taking off point in the record. And so artifacts are just here and kind of stored, and not so much work done here, pretty much done on the job. Combine them all the information that we have and all of the past that we could look up of what people did, and come up with something new, something further than what there is. So I believe in the new, and I just like more. Don't tell me that I'm doing too much, and certainly don't tell me that I'm not doing enough, because I'll do more then. And I know I like more, but I just want to see a combination of all this come together into a new kind of a hybrid style based on the classics.
We have a world of patterns and brackets and ideas. I'm going to have to just throw it away, I think, when I'm finally gone. But it's nice to be able to pass that on if there's an interest in it. It's a modern way now. And otherwise, I would just get rid of it. Just set it up in a pile, and I tell my son, and he worked with me for a while, I said, you could have all these patterns and parts, and he said, I'd rather make my own, and what do I do if I'm gone, And he said, I'm going to take it all in a pile, and I'm going to take it to Burning Man and put it in a pile and burn it, and that would be fine with me. I mean, it's very Zen-like in a way. It's very of the moment, and San Francisco has always changed, and let them go that direction if they want. How many more years do I have of this? If I could have the energy, and if there was the interest in Victorian facades, it would be nice as a legacy to let them continue. And otherwise, I'm ready to close the door on San Francisco and let the techies have it. Let them stucco it over if that's what they want. So I'm kind of ready to let it go after seeing it over these 50 years evolve. And so I think I would always be building in that other style. And I think if I didn't have my lovely wife Pegasus, I'd probably just be an expatriate and go to Bali or something and come up with something new.
Why did people build the houses that they built, and what made those historical styles popular? Those are fascinating questions to me, and all over the world there are structures that people build for whatever reason. I'm also very interested in history generally and how it explains who we are now.
They came into the kitchen, and I was really proud of some of the things I had done in my house, and I was showing the little archways, and they looked at each other, and not only did they know who had done the archways, they knew who had modeled for them. And I thought, my God, this is the real deal. These are the people who created the whole San Francisco movement of restoration. I knew I was in very good hands.